Hey, how you doing?
Hey, sorry I'm late.
Oh, okay, no worries, no worries. Just to give you a heads up, I don't know if I told you I'm currently in Africa, so it's not as technologically advanced. So if we get disconnected, it'll continue to record, and you can continue speaking, and then I'll edit it before I put it out.
Okay. Well, I'm in Brookline, Massachusetts, and my internet's terrible too. So we'll see who's worse.
Okay, okay. I want to thank you so much for coming on the platform. I really appreciate you taking out the time to stop by. I'm definitely interested in hearing more about the amazing work you're doing.
Thanks for the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
Definitely, definitely. It's an honor. For the viewers who may not recognize you, could you let them know who you are, where you're from, and definitely what do you do?
I am Steve Levitsky. I am professor of government at Harvard University. I'm also the director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard. I work mostly on issues of democracy and authoritarianism. My background is in Latin America, but in recent years, I have focused, unfortunately, had to focus a lot of my attention on the fate of democracy in the United States, which I think is very much at risk.
Wow. Okay, that's very, very interesting. Now I can ask you this: when did you develop this passion for Latin American studies? Is this something that you were always into when you were younger, or did you kind of get into it later in life?
No, no, it goes back to middle school when I started studying Spanish. And back in the 1980s, when I was first in high school and college, there were a series of civil wars in Central America. U.S. foreign policy was very much implicated in civil in violence and dictatorship in Central America. And I was initially interested in Latin America as an activist, as someone who was quite critical of the Reagan administration's policies in Central America. Well, when I got to college, I took some classes and just had an opportunity to travel to Latin America, fell in love with the region, and have been working on the region nonstop really for about 35 years.
Wow. Okay. Okay. I got the opportunity to study abroad. I did a semester in Dominican Republic, and I did another semester in Brazil. It was a life changing experience. I really enjoyed my time out there. I learned a lot. The culture is so beautiful.
Yes. No,
Now I can
it doesn't take much to really fall in love with the region.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. Now, like you said, you was doing this in the '80s. I can ask you, do you feel like there has been a significant change in the government and the structure of Latin America, or is it more the same, or is it kind of a little bit of both?
Good question. I think it's very much a little bit of both. There are things that have not changed and that change very, very slowly. Latin America is and really always has been one of the most unequal regions in the world. That goes back to the colonial experience, literally, 5 centuries ago. The levels of wealth and income inequality in Latin America, in just about every country in Latin America, are extreme. Latin America is a place where the the state, the institutions of the state, the machinery of government tend to be pretty weak. So the state's ability to protect citizens from crime, from violence, from abuse is often pretty low. So levels of violence in Latin America are pretty high, criminal violence in particular. But that said, there have been a lot of changes. The region has gotten much, much wealthier since the 1980s. We tend to think of Latin America as poor, and parts of it are poor, but it's really mostly a middle income region. And some countries in the region, Uruguay, Chile, Argentina, are now considered upper income. So Mexico, Brazil there's a lot of poverty in these countries, but there's also very big, relatively well off middle classes that didn't exist in the region 40 or 50 years ago. The region is also much more democratic than it used to be. Latin America has a long history of instability, of authoritarianism, sometimes political violence. But with a few exceptions, the region has been overwhelmingly democratic over the last 30 years. It's much more democratic than at any other period of its history. And that period of democracy is allowing for a gradual expansion of rights to groups that have historically been marginalized and even oppressed in Latin America. So um, much to do in terms of inclusion and rights expansion, but Latin America is a much more inclusive and much more democratic place than it's ever been before.
Okay, okay. I appreciate you breaking that down. Now, I wanted to ask you about this. You had mentioned, in more recent years, you've been focusing on democracy and the government in the U.S. Was there one single incident in particular that kind of guided you in that direction, or was it like a multitude of things?
No, it was pretty specific. It was the emergence of Donald Trump on the political scene in the United States in 2015 and 2016. My colleague and I, Daniel Ziblatt, with whom I wrote How Democracies Die, um, basically had a conversation in the hallways at work in the government department at Harvard. Daniel is a student of European politics, in particular Europe during the 1930s. Uh, as we discussed, I studied Latin America. I spent a lot of time studying the collapse of democracy in Latin America in the 1960s and the 1970s. And what we realized is as soon as Trump first entered the political scene in the Republican primaries in 2016, is that this is something that was unusual, that was pretty new in US politics, at least in modern US politics. But it's something that he and I had seen before, something he'd seen in 1930s Europe, something I've seen in Latin America in the 1960s and 70s, which was the rise of a political leader who was not committed to democratic rules of the game, a politician whose instincts were more authoritarian than democratic. And so Daniel and I started talking. We started writing. We wrote an op-ed right after Trump got elected, and that led to the book "How Democracies Die," which was basically an effort. Doesn't seem, in retrospect, to have been very successful, but an effort to warn Americans uh, of the dangers that Trump and the movement that he has inspired or that has helped to give rise to him, the dangers that poses to U.S. democracy.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Now I can ask you this if you didn't mention it already. Now, how long did it take you to complete this project?
Well, we've written two books now. How Democracies Die, we wrote in the year 2017, a little less than a year. It came out in 2018. And then in between the two Trump presidencies, early on in the Biden administration, we decided to write a second book, which is called Tyranny of the Minority, which takes a step back and tries to explain how the United States got in this mess in which its democracy is on the verge of breakdown. We tend to assume that we are one of the most stable democracies in the world. And in fact, no democracy is rich or as old as the United States. Even if you date the birth of US democracy at 1965, which I think is the right date because that's the date at which the United States achieved full adult suffrage. Even if you say the US democracy is born in 1965, no democracy as old or as rich as the United States has ever broken down. So this situation we're in now, on the brink of a slide into some form of authoritarianism, is a really unusual thing. It's something that political scientists didn't expect, and it's something that in our second book we tried to explain, tried to get out why the hell this is happening.
Okay, okay. Now I can ask you this. Politics is a touchy subject. It can be controversial. Did you get a lot of pushback for these projects?
Um, not. I mean, Academic pushback, yes. There are, particularly the second book. I mean, Daniel and I, when we go on media, we will occasionally get, online harassment, things like that. That basically anybody who speaks about anything publicly gets these days. That really hasn't been particularly troublesome. The first book, How Democracies Die, didn't generate a lot of pushback. Uh, the second book, Tyranny of the Minority, which offers an explanation for why the Republican Party has turned away from democracy, that's generated a little bit more pushback. But there are different theories, there are different explanations for why the U.S. has gotten into the trouble that it's in. And I think the book has generated a fair amount of debate, and that's what should happen. That's what you should expect. Nobody's got a monopoly on the truth.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely interesting and thought provoking. Now, I can ask you this. I assume a lot of your students, they may be younger. Are they receptive to this information? What is their reaction? Are they divided, or are they kind of, on one side?
A good question. So, the way that um, demographics in the United States have worked themselves in the 21st century, it universities are pretty blue in the sense that there aren't very many Trump supporters at Harvard, and which is too bad. Universities should be pluralist places. They should have a diversity of viewpoints, and we have a diversity of viewpoints on a whole bunch of dimensions. But there are Republicans, there are conservatives, there are not a lot of Trumpists, and so I in our work we're very, very critical of Trump and Trumpism. We characterize it as a serious threat to not only to democracy as we've known it, but to the emerging multiracial democracy that we've been trying to build in this country in the 21st century. And there's a lot of hostility towards our arguments, a lot of opposition to our arguments, but in the university, among the students that I teach, it's pretty well received. In general, I think college students are more open to the ideas behind multiracial democracy than your average American.
Okay, okay. Now, my next question is this: now that Trump is back in office, are there any solutions? Is there anything that the people can do in terms of, I guess, preserving the democracy or making it better?
Sure. There's always something you can do. This, saving democracy or preserving democracy or improving democracy, it's a it's a long running battle. It's not something that it's not just a 3 act play. There are many, many, many rounds, and this round coming up is going to be pretty ugly. Donald Trump and the Trump administration are going to take some pretty serious swings at our institutions and at our rights. Um, but it gets much worse if people, out of fear or out of exhaustion or out of whatever reason, if people give up, if people just sort of move to the sideline and say, because I'm tired. It's been 8 years of thinking and arguing and debating and writing about the threat that Trump poses, and it was exhausting. It was a hell of a gut punch to have Trump come back and win the popular vote after the guy tried to lead a coup 4 years ago. But here we are, and we cannot allow exhaustion or fear or pragmatism to lead us to give up and just say, the hell with it. Because when we give up, the bad guys win. And so we got to keep fighting. And that means being involved, and not just involved online, but involved in the street, in organizations, working with people. There are 1,000 different causes. There's no single issue or single thing people should do. People should get involved around something that they care about, but stay involved. Speak out when they see wrongdoing, and for God's sake, get ready to vote and mobilize people to vote in 2026 and 2028, because Trump is going to do a lot of damage in the next few years, but he's not going to be able to cancel elections. There will be elections in 2 years. There will be elections in 4 years, and the most important thing that we can do is make sure that this spell of MAGA government is a short one.
Okay, okay. Now, How Democracies Die. It's a New York Times bestseller. It's published in 30 different languages. Now, were you expecting this when you wrote this, and what was your reaction to getting all of these people from outside of the states so interested?
No. I mean, I never. Usually, political scientists write books, and we're lucky if 1,000 copies get sold. They basically get sold to university libraries, and my mother never even read any of my books before How Democracies Die. So we did not expect this. This was very unusual. It's not very often that anybody gives a damn about what political scientists have to say. But I think we sort of tapped into something that it's not. Obviously, Americans are concerned about the fate of their democracy, but as it turns out, so are Brazilians, and so are Mexicans, and so are Germans, and so are Indians and Indonesians, and people in countries in every continent in the world see similar patterns. They see similar threats. So people in Kenya were buying our book, and people in Senegal and South Africa and Pakistan, literally every continent on earth. It's not that the book was so great, but that the issue that we were taking up was really relevant for people across the world, and that's why I think the book sold so much in so many different places.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Yeah, because I'm a world traveler. I've been to about 70 countries, and I come to learn to see that people are really, really interested in what's going on in America. More than we may think. Um,
Yeah.
Now I can ask you this: as interesting as the books are, these are great thought provoking topics. Have you ever considered doing maybe like a documentary or a film or anything like that?
Well, I mean, that's not. I don't know. I don't know how to make a film. I've participated in the sense that there have been a bunch of very good documentaries made in recent years about the global crisis of democracy, about the crisis in the United States, and which I think are really important because, especially today, more and more people don't read; they learn through video, and so I think the instinct behind your question is right on. I don't have the skills, the training, the ability to make films myself, but whenever I get asked to help out and be interviewed for such a project, I try to do it.
Okay. Okay. Now I can ask you about this. You currently working on a project, and it kind of deals with going across the world.
Yeah, the book that I am working on now is about the fate of the sustainability of democracy worldwide, and we're actually and we started writing this before Trump got reelected, I got to say. But we're at least somewhat hopeful that democracies in many parts of the world are more resilient than people think. There, no question, democracy faces greater challenges than it has at any time in the last 40 years or so. But what we're arguing in the book, and the book looks at democracies all over the world, in Asia, in Latin America, in Europe, in Africa, and argues that despite a whole bunch of challenges, despite the rise of China, despite Putin, despite Trump, despite COVID, despite some pretty serious economic crises, most democracies have proven pretty resilient. And so the book is about why, in spite of some really tough challenges, democracies in most parts of the world are hanging in there, are managing to sort of muddle through.
Okay, okay. Now, can I ask you, by you looking at democracies from different parts of the world, I mean, do you feel like, they are still looking at America as, I guess the example, or have they kind of, passed us up in some regards, or?
That is a great question. And I haven't visited as many countries as you have, so you may have a better sense than I. But I think it's mixed, and I think it's changing. There's no question that the United States is not the model democracy. I don't think it was ever the model of democracy that Americans thought it was, but it's nowhere near the model that it once was. It is really, really hard for any American to go abroad and say, look at how we do things. This is how you make a democracy work. Because the United States has been pretty dysfunctional now for quite a while. But as you said, people still watch what's going on in the United States. The United States is a big, wealthy, very powerful, very influential place. And so whatever happens in the United States, people are paying attention. And I think one thing that I worry about is we can be a bad model just as we can be potentially a good model. In an ideal world, I think the United States could be a model multiracial democracy that a bunch of other countries could learn a lot of positive things from. But people right now are watching Trump and they're learning from Trump. And they're saying things like, well, if Donald Trump can deny the results of an election and try to overturn the results of an election like he did in 2020, 2021, well, why can't I? And if Donald Trump can treat the media, call the media the enemy of the people, then, well, maybe it's legitimate for me to do that. And you see the kind of the worst things that Trump does diffusing across the world and being replicated by others. Because if the U.S. can do it, well, why not country X or country Y or country Z? And so increasingly, this is something I worry a lot about in the 4 years to come. The U.S. is becoming a model for authoritarian behavior, for thuggish behavior, rather than for democratic behavior, and rather than protecting and preserving rights.
Okay, okay. We're about 23 minutes in, so I guess I wanted to ask you one last question. A lot of the guests I interview, they'll speak about AI and modern technology, whether they're into medicine or music or film or even law. How do you view the effects of the technology and AI on government in particular?
That is a great question. I think I'm not going to give a very satisfying answer. One, because for two reasons. One is it's not an area that I'm expert in at all. I'm trying to learn as much as everyone else. And two, I think it's really early. It's hard um, to reach any conclusions yet about the impact of rapidly and dramatically changing media technologies. I think there's pretty good evidence that social media over the last 10 years or so, 10 or 12 years, has contributed to the polarization of politics in many countries, certainly the United States, but many other countries as well. It is having a radicalizing effect on some people. Obviously, the spread of disinformation has been a challenge for new democracies as well. So it is changing technologies have proven a challenge to existing democracies, mostly because I think it is eroding public trust in established elites, for better or worse, and it's contributing to polarization. I think we've had new technologies in the past. People were very worried about the spread of radio in the 1930s. They were very worried about the spread of television in the mid 20th century. My guess is that there's a pretty good chance we will adapt to this new technology as well. But we're going to have to learn as citizens, as politicians, as governments, how to live with these technologies, how not to be overcome, or how not to let new technologies destroy our politics. And I think we're at the very early stages of learning the consequences of these technologies, the potential consequences, and learning how to adapt to them and how to live with them, how to regulate them. I know that's a very kind of a fuzzy answer, but I think we're really at a very early stage. We know that the impact is significant, maybe more significant than many of us thought, but we have not really yet begun to adapt.
Okay, yeah, you definitely made some great points because I know, like you say, it's so much misinformation. You see things and you don't know if it's true. You got to get it fact checked. You got to Google it and check again. So I definitely can relate to that. But I want to thank you again so much for the work that you're doing. It's very important work. I look forward to the work that you have coming in the future, and I want to thank you again for stopping by on the podcast. I really appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. Best of luck to you.
All right, take care.